1966, Detroit, Michigan. I still remember vividly the distinctive mix of smells that characterized those shows. The smell of wood paint from old props, the smell of confetti scattered after rehearsals, and the smell of the hot stage lights that seemed to burn everything they touched. Those were the early years of the Jackson 5, when we were just kids with dreams bigger than our own heights. But amidst the flash of lights and cheers, there was always a dark space that no one but us could really touch, backstage. And it was in that dark space that a story began, as light as a breath, but enough to change the way I looked at my brother forever. Michael was 7 years old then. Small, agile, his eyes so big and clear that sometimes when he looked straight into me, I forgot he was just a kid. Michael always smiled, always held my shirt when we walked through the long hallways behind the stage, but deep down, I knew he was more sensitive than any of us. Every compliment lit him up, and every slightly overdone joke could shut him up for hours. That night, we performed at a local theater, a place not very big, but to us then, it felt like the world. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, the high ceilings were covered with old round bulbs. The left wing was filled with wires coiled around each other like sleeping snakes. To the right was a row of metal chairs where other groups of artists sat waiting their turn. I took Michael's hand and led him backstage. He held my hand so tightly that my fingers were numb, but I said nothing. I knew he needed that reassurance. Then I heard it, a soft laugh from behind the half-closed door. A remark, so light it seemed like no offense, but it hit the child where it was most vulnerable. Is that the tiny kid everyone talks about? The remark wasn't harsh, but in the backstage environment where the sound echoed and sharpened, it felt like a small needle piercing the already tense atmosphere of the show. I glanced over and saw a few adults, artists from other companies, laughing and talking to each other. One of them pointed at us. None of them meant to be hurtful. Sometimes adults don't realize that children hear more than they think. Another added, his tone half joking, half exaggerated, but still making me uncomfortable. He looks like he needs a step stool to reach the mic. It was a casual remark, but I saw Michael's shoulders tense. He bowed his head and I felt his hand slowly slip from mine as if he wanted to withdraw. I turned around. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. Michael just nodded, but the nod was so fragile that a strong wind might have blown it away. Actually, later when I grew up and heard from some of the people who were there that day, I learned that not all the teasing was aimed at Michael. Some of it was just retellings from other people's memories. Some of it was blurred by time. But I remember very clearly the feeling at that time, the discomfort tightening in my chest, the pain that made me want to pull my brother away from everything. We went deeper backstage. The sounds echoed, the tapping of shoes, the sound of someone practicing each piece of music, the manager outside shouting, "Jackson 5, ready in 10. The atmosphere was both bustling and tense, like an over-tightened string. Michael sat down on the small wooden chair placed near the dressing table. He was silent, his eyes glued to the white gloves on his lap. I sat next to him, clearly feeling the silence stretching between us. "Jermaine, can you do it?" Michael's voice was low, as if only for me to hear. The question pierced me. Michael had never doubted himself in front of an audience, at least not before that night, but now, because of a few innocuous words, he was starting to fear that his talent wasn't enough. I wanted to tell him he was great, that he was the soul of the group, that the audience loved his voice. I wanted to hug him and block out all the other vague words. But I knew one thing, the stage was not a place for overprotection. Michael needed to stand up for himself, strong from the inside, if he wanted to continue this journey. I put my hand on his shoulder. "You can do it," I said. "You always can." And those words, let them go. Michael didn't answer, but he raised his head, his eyes sparkling in the yellow light. I knew he was still sad, and kids don't hide their emotions as well as adults, but there was a tiny spark in that look, a spark of hope or rebellion or determination. I wasn't sure, but it was there, smoldering like a newly lit fire. The last minutes before the show passed eerily slowly. The sounds around him seemed to fade until the MC's voice boomed, loud and decisive. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Jackson 5. Michael squeezed my hand one last time, tightly, then let go. He stood up, his back was straight, his face was turned toward the stage, and right then I felt a storm rising inside that little boy. A quiet storm that was about to sweep away all the teasing laughter behind the velvet curtain. The moment Michael stepped out of his chair, I felt the air in the room change as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Not because of the weather, but because of a strange feeling creeping up my spine, a feeling every artist knows the moment before a show is always a place of tension, fear, and the desire to shine. I was still standing there, watching Michael's small figure, when the voices behind me started up again. Not loud, not malicious, but at that sensitive moment, they were like invisible needles. "He looks nervous," someone said. "Hope the little guy won't freeze on stage." I listened, and I knew Michael listened too. Though he didn't turn his head, his shoulders jerked slightly, enough for me to realize that each word that entered his ears left a small scratch. I can't be sure that all of this is word for word. Part of it is my memory, part of it is what some of the crew later told me, but I know for sure that the atmosphere that day was very heavy for a child. I stepped closer, intending to say something to reassure her, but as I placed my hand on her small shoulder, Michael turned to look at me. That look wasn't as sad as before, but it wasn't quite peaceful either. It was a mix of hurt and something that was forming, like seeing a cracked mirror, but behind it, light was shining through the cracks. "I'm fine," Michael said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "It's just, I want to do well. I don't want them to think I'm weak." My heart sank when I heard that. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to think like that. Not worth facing that kind of pressure. It's not worth being afraid of being judged or judged, but Michael is not a normal kid, and his life has never been normal. From afar, Dad calls to us, "Boys, positions." The sound is like a strong tug that brings us back to reality. The lights from the stage crevices shine into the backstage, creating long streaks on the floor. The light shines on Michael's face, and I realize he is breathing very lightly, as if trying to keep calm with each small breath. We line up right next to the wings. This is the last waiting point before stepping out in front of hundreds of eyes. I stand behind Michael, placing my hand lightly on his back, not to push him, but to remind him that I am here, right behind him no matter what happens. But what surprises me is not his trembling. It's Michael's small hands that are clenched into fists, very lightly but very clearly. I have never seen him do that before the show. Ahead of us, the theater manager was whispering to another member. I caught a few words, not disparaging but not helpful either. "They're talented kids, but the youngest, let's hope he keeps up." To an adult, that might have been a casual observation, but to me, at that moment, it sounded like the sound of metal grinding against metal, cold, sharp, and making me want to turn around and tell him to be more careful, but I didn't. I took a breath, trying to calm myself. It wasn't about my own feelings anymore. Michael turned his head. "Jermaine, did I disappoint you?" My heart felt like it was being squeezed, not because the question hurt, but because I realized Michael wasn't afraid of the others. He was afraid of disappointing us, afraid of not meeting expectations, fear of not being big enough. I knelt down to her eye level. "You've never let anyone down," I said, each word slowly. "No matter what happens, you're still Michael, and that's more than enough." Michael looked at me, his eyes sparkling but not a tear falling. Perhaps he had gotten used to holding back his emotions long ago. A second later, the MC's voice rang out again, louder this time, full of excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the incredible, the unstoppable, the Jackson 5. The cheers from the auditorium shook the floor. It's often said that the sound of a crowd carries a special power. It can be both a healing and a knife, depending on the listener. I looked at Michael. He took a deep breath, then stepped toward the light. But at that moment, the very second he was about to step through the curtain, something happened that I'll never forget. One of the jokers, standing far away, blurted out, "Hope he doesn't crack." It didn't matter if it was a joke or a passing remark, but Michael heard it. I saw him pause for half a second, as if he'd been pulled from the only support he was holding on to. A half a second is a small second, but to a child before a show, it felt like a century. I put my hand on his shoulder again, trying to instill a sense of security in him. "Go," I said softly, "just be yourself." And then Michael walked out, alone, small in the light, but I could feel it. Something was changing inside him. Something was about to explode. I stood in the shadows of the backstage, and for the first time I saw the edge of anxiety. It was fragile, trembling, and ready to turn into some kind of strength I had never seen in her. I just didn't expect it would happen that very night, in a way that everyone later fell silent when they remembered it. The stage lights hit me hard, as Michael stepped through the curtain. It was so bright that I had to squint, but Michael didn't. He stood there in a sea of white light, so small that if anyone just glanced at him, they wouldn't believe that the soul of the whole show was in his body. I stood in the shadows of the wings, staring at my brother, as if I looked away for even a second, everything would collapse. And then the thing I was most worried about happened. The microphone was too high. I saw the gap clearly. A very small gap for an adult, but for a 7-year-old it was like a wall. Michael raised his face. As soon as his eyes touched the top of the microphone, he immediately looked down. I recognized it, the instinctive reaction of a child who had been laughed at for being too small. The audience was silent. The audience was silent. No one knew what was happening, only a strange pause. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Each beat was so loud it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. "Michael, do it," I whispered, knowing he couldn't hear me. He stood still for a few seconds, seconds that felt like years. Someone might think he was scared. Someone might think he'd forgotten his song. But no, I'd watched Michael long enough to know he was fighting something inside, fighting the words he'd said earlier, the broken laughter from backstage, and the nameless fear that children hold in their hearts without speaking out. Then, Michael raised his hand. No shaking, no hesitation, just a movement so clean and precise I couldn't tell if it was instinct or determination. He grabbed the microphone stand and pulled it down with a light, decisive jerk. The metal slid down with a screech so clear it silenced the entire backstage behind me. I felt like the world was tilting, and then something strange happened. Michael wasn't looking at us, not at the audience, but at the brightest light on the stage, like a child staring straight at what scared him, determined not to run away. At that moment, the intro music started, the familiar melody, the pounding drums, and as soon as the first verse came, Michael opened his mouth. That voice, I'd heard it hundreds of times in the practice room, in the house, in the backyard, but this night it was different. It was stronger, louder, and something flowed from deep inside the boy, as if Michael were singing to convince himself that he wasn't as small as everyone said. He sang each note as if each one was an answer to the teasing. Each rising note was an affirmation, "I'm not weak." Each long drawn-out line was a gentle but sharp protest. The audience, who had expected to see a cute performance by talented kids, was silent for a few seconds before they started cheering. The applause swelled in waves, rushing onto the stage as if to embrace Michael. I stood backstage, goosebumps all over my body. I had performed with him dozens of times, but that night I felt like I was witnessing a moment the world would look back on and say, "That's when it all began." Michael turned, taking a few small steps to the beat of the music. His movements weren't complex choreography, just the instinctive movements of a child set to music. But what left everyone speechless was, he did everything as if the stage were his home. I glanced backstage to the right. The people who had been joking about him earlier were now standing still. No one said anything. A few opened their mouths slightly as if to say something, but stopped. I'd never seen them like this before. Michael continued singing. No misspoken words, not a trace of fear remained. He coordinated every little movement, a stomp of the foot, a tilt of the head, hands touching the microphone as if controlling it, all with such natural ease that it was hard to understand. I looked at the man standing next to me, an older backstage worker, and he whispered, "That kid, he's something else." I only heard this remark from a few people present later. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat tightened as if someone had forced it. And then the song's finale came. Michael drew out the last note longer than usual with such force that the entire theater seemed to stretch with him. As he reached the last word, the stage lights converged on his position, creating a moment that I swear looked like the opening scene of a legend. Then silence, not a sound, not a whisper, not a gasp, just absolute silence. And in that moment, a moment when the world seemed to stop to look at the 7-year-old standing in the light, I realized something I had never dared to say out loud. Michael was no longer just my little brother. He had just towered over all of us. The audience erupted in applause, but the loudest thing was the complete silence of those who had been teasing him just minutes before. I knew this was just the beginning. As the last note of the song ended, it felt like the entire theater had fallen into a deep silence, a silence so quiet it took your breath away. No applause immediately, no noise, no whispers, not even the metallic creaking of the stage whenever someone moved a prop, just absolute silence. I looked out from the wings and saw Michael standing there, head slightly raised, eyes fixed on the spotlight. He didn't look scared. He didn't look confused. He didn't look around for confirmation. No, he stood there as if he were the center of all the light, and then, like a wave breaking off the surface of the ocean, the applause exploded. The audience cheered, the sound of shoes hitting the floor resounding loudly. A few people shouted, "Yeah," from the front row. A rain of sound crashed onto the stage as if to embrace Michael, lift him off the ground. But what sent a chill down my spine and wasn't the stage. It was right behind me, and backstage. I turned. Everyone stood still. The adults who had been joking, the laughs that had Michael looking down, were now silent as statues. A few even opened their mouths slightly, as if they wanted to speak but didn't know what to say. A large man, who I remembered laughing at Michael's trembling when he first came on stage, stood with his arms crossed in confusion, watching the 7-year-old with an expression that was difficult to articulate. I heard someone whisper, "How did he do that?" I only heard this later from a backstage crew member who was there that day. I still remember his voice, as if something had just flipped inside his head. Michael wasn't just a good singer. He wasn't just cute. He wasn't just a talented kid. No. The boy had just demonstrated something no one thought a 7-year-old could demonstrate. Courage. No one said anything else. No one showed any other reaction. The silence wasn't because they weren't appreciative. They were stunned. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look at the stage. Michael bowed, then bowed again. He turned around, his eyes shining like 1,000 lights on the ceiling. The host then lowered the microphone for him to say hello to the audience, but Michael just waved and smiled. A small smile, so small, but it made my heart clench. And then he ran backstage, where I was standing, where the people who had hurt him by accident were looking at him with completely different eyes. Michael stepped through the velvet curtain. For the first half second, I thought someone would say something, a compliment, an exclamation, a vague apology like adults sometimes do. But no one spoke. Michael looked around. He flinched slightly at the awkward silence. I didn't wait another second. I ran to hug him. "You did it," I said, my voice shaking so much it surprised me. "You did great, Michael." Michael put his arms around my waist and hugged me back, but what surprised me was he wasn't shaking, he wasn't tense. There was no trace of the scared boy he'd been. He sighed softly. "I just didn't want them to think I wasn't strong enough, Jermaine." I held him tighter. That statement from a 7-year-old choked me so much that I couldn't respond right away. When I let Michael go, I noticed something strange. One of the people who had teased him earlier was standing against the wall, looking down at the floor, not out of outright embarrassment, but out of realization that he had misjudged him. A backstage crew member walked over. He crouched down a little, not exactly to Michael's level, but as if to respect his space, and said in a low voice, "You did great out there. Really great. This is a cast member's account, not an official record." Michael smiled. It wasn't arrogant, it wasn't smug, just the smile of a child who had been acknowledged. The atmosphere changed. A few people started nodding at Michael. A woman from the costume department smiled at him, a gentle smile I'd never seen her give us before. No one apologized for the jokes, but they didn't need to. The way they looked at Michael now was enough. Michael stood there, small but radiant. Under the pale yellow backstage lights, he looked like a small candle that everyone thought would go out when the wind blew, but instead burned stronger. He raised his head, looked at me, and whispered, "Jermaine, I'm not scared anymore." Those words, simple, innocent, but so powerful, froze the memory of that night in my mind. Michael was only 7 years old, but in that moment, he stood taller than everyone in the room. As the noise of the auditorium gradually faded away like a receding tide, the backstage returned to the pale yellow lights and the warm breaths of those still standing there, as if unable to leave the moment they had just witnessed. Michael and I stood close together, our backs against the old prop crates that had followed us from stage to stage, carrying the smell of rotting wood and fabric from years of wandering. But today, those crates were no longer normal. They were like silent witnesses to a moment that I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my life. No one joked about Michael anymore. No one repeated the careless jokes from before. Instead, there was still silence, but not the awkward silence as before, but the silence of recognition of something that had just changed not only in everyone's eyes, but in the very atmosphere of this small room. I looked at Michael. The boy rested his hands on his knees, breathing lightly, his hair slightly damp with sweat, but his eyes, they were still bright, still alive, still vibrating with the music that was still lingering in his body. Michael suddenly raised his head, asked very softly, as if afraid to disturb the already sacred space, "Jermaine, when I pulled the microphone down, did everyone see?" I laughed, a very small laugh, full of restraint, full of pride, and a little surprised, as if I was still not used to a 7-year-old doing what he had just done. "Michael," I said. The whole room looked, and no one could say anything. The boy pursed his lips, not with pride, not with complacency, but as if he was trying to keep that moment under his own skin, to put it in a secret compartment of his heart. I knew Michael. He always avoided showing off, but I also sensed that what had just happened had planted a seed in him, a seed of confidence, of strength that ordinary children would never have expected. To the left, some other performers were packing up. They glanced at Michael, but it was a different look, gentle, respectful, a little surprised. One of them, as I was later told by several members of the troupe, spoke quietly, "Kid's got fire." No one denied it, no one objected, no one laughed. All knew what they had just witnessed was no accident. Adults with years of experience in the profession often see stage energy very early. And that night they saw, in a 7-year-old boy, something few dare admit out loud, a spark that can grow into a flame. I touched Michael's shoulder lightly. "You know what?" I asked. "When the stage lit up, I saw you bigger." Michael frowned. "But you didn't grow taller." I laughed. The boy was still the boy. In the midst of all that magic, he was still the sweet child with curious eyes and a sensitive heart. I sat down next to Michael. As we talked, I heard footsteps behind me. A man from the technical team, the one who had commented half-jokingly at the beginning, approached. I squeezed Michael's hand slightly, afraid that he would feel sad again, but he stopped just enough distance away, then said in a low, unadorned voice, "Good job, kid." Just 3 words, very short, but they carried more weight than the applause outside. Michael nodded politely, and when the man left, I saw him smile slightly, the smile of someone who had just walked through a door he had previously not dared to touch. I looked around. Backstage was no longer a place that scared Michael. It was no longer a dark maze of teasing laughter. It had become a place to witness the unexpected growth of a boy, and in that moment, I understood one thing. Michael's legacy did not begin on big stages, did not begin when he became an icon. It began right here, behind the curtain, in a small theater, when a 7-year-old boy decided not to let the world scare him. Michael stood up, brushed his clothes as if preparing for the next act, but instead of running around looking for a place to play like usual, he walked toward the wings, looking out at the stage that had just made him shine. No one called him, no one made him stand there, but Michael stood still as if wanting to engrave every ray of light, every clap, every smallest moment into his soul. "Jermaine," he whispered, "when I grow up, I want to stand on bigger stages." I looked at the child in front of me, his small shadow stretching out on the wooden floor of the wings, and I don't know why, but I believed, absolutely believed. I put my hand on his head, gently stroking it. "You'll stand in places where the light itself has to chase you." Michael smiled, a soft, innocent smile, but in it I saw a whole world opening up. And that was the exact moment I knew. Michael Jackson's legacy wasn't born in front of millions of people. It was born here, in the silence of the backstage, a silence that changed everything.